Hey guys, what's up? Public here back with another video, and today we're talking about trinkets as a Shadow Priest inside of Season 3. I'm going to talk about from a PvE perspective what trinkets you want to aim for both Raid and Mythic Plus, so let's dive in. Okay, so I know I talked about this in one of my previous videos, kind of introducing Season 3, but I wanted to kind of do a deep dive video of kind of more specifically when to be thinking about which trinkets inside of Season 3. In addition, since I recorded that video, they have done some light trinket tuning that has changed at least one option, so I did want to kind of come back and make sure that people have the most up-to-date information. Icy Veins is already updated by the time you're watching this, so if you're curious, you'll see me gonna go through it in the background. But I think one thing that's clear, and you can probably see this in the background with this is just the single target charts in the background right here, is that, interestingly enough, we haven't seen this in quite some time, but every single trinket that comes out of the Ember raid as a ranged DPS is competitive and it's used as a shadow, which is quite unique, not something that happens very often. Now, the difference here is that trinkets are a bit more, they're not super straightforward these days, and so what that means is it's not a case of saying, get these two trinkets and then you'll use them all the time for everything. It seems like they've kind of transitioned to having, more specific use cases where certain trinkets shine versus others. It's a little bit more complicated than just, is it single target or is it AoE, which has been kind of something we've looked at in the past. So we'll go to the charts here in a second, but to kind of summarize this, what I've written in the guide is kind of showcasing these downsides. So from a rating perspective, we kind of have this flow chart of when to use which trinkets based on some questions. So first up, are you able to be in melee range? If you're talking about from a raid perspective, can you be in melee? You should use Belleros the Suncaller. So this is a melee trinket that, I say a melee trinket, it's for ranged DPS, but it does AoE damage 10 yards around your character. So you have to actually physically walk your character into melee to use this trinket. Now, if you can do that, it's great. On single target, on AoE, whatever it is, trinket does quite well for itself. But that caveat is really important because we are a ranged DPS. There will be cases where you just simply can't reliably be in melee every 2 minutes, which is the cooldown of the trinket. If you are in that case, this is a great trinket to use. There's also a caveat here of like, can you use this with ads? Like, does the boss have significant ads that need to die quickly? So like, Tindril Slaves himself, where the trinket drops, is a great example for using this on the roots on that fight. Gnarl Root has some good examples as well, so that's also something to consider, but generally speaking, it's just a question of, are you able to be in melee range? If you can, this is your best in slot trinket, more or less. Now, moving on, the next thing to check is Nuse. So this is a weird question. Is your target immobilized? So Nuse Unraveling Spindle is kind of taking a hybrid approach to being a damage trinket and a secondary stat effect trinket. So as you can see here, it's a channeled spell which deals nature damage over 3 seconds, and then the longer you channel, the more mastery that you get for 18 seconds after that channel ends. So pretty simple. You're basically going to use this before you go into your cooldowns to get that mastery buff for as much of our cooldowns as possible. But it is something to keep in mind that the damage is not insignificant. It is still a good part of the trinket's budget, so you kind of want to factor that in. And there's an extra effect on that damage which says damage is increased by 30% against immobilized targets. So normally this is going to be stuff like fears or stuns, that kind of thing, where the target is, it's immobilized. Now the trick is that is not possible with boss targets, because bosses can't be stunned, can't be feared, that kind of stuff doesn't work. Obviously, like trash mobs inside of Mythic Plus, you can do that kind of thing, but not something that works against bosses. Now, because they specifically said immobilized, there are bosses that actually count as being immobilized. In fact, training dummies are also counted. What this means is most bosses that are kind of in like a stationary planted mode count as being immobilized. I'll scroll down to this section just to give you this list, but what we've seen so far, there might be some other examples. I kind of poured through my logs of raid testing, and these were the 3 that popped out to me. I did look at some others that did not count, but we'll see when this goes live. But on PTR testing, Gnarl during the intermission phase, Volcaros, and Nime, these 3 examples count the boss as being immobilized, which means you get that extra, in this case, 30% extra damage on the damage part when you use the trinket, which isn't something to scoff at. and definitely makes it very competitive. So if your target is immobilized, and it's more of like a single target situation, Nime is a great pickup to use. And importantly, as we go down this list, obviously we're already at 2 unused trinkets. I'm about to list even more. Stacking unused trinkets is traditionally a little sketchy. It's better this tier simply because we're stacking Belleros with another unused trinket. Because Belleros just deals straight up damage, and literally nothing in our kit scales its damage. Ancient Madness doesn't, Twisted Fate doesn't, our damage amps during cooldowns, nothing. So there's no reason for us to specifically use Belleros in cooldowns. Our goal with Belleros is just to use it as often as possible. So what this ends up looking like, depending on the trinket that you're pairing it with, is Nime is the case where you use it right before your cooldowns, and then from then on out, you just use Belleros on cooldown 20 seconds later. Number 3 is Balefire Branch. So this one's also a little, again, there's a question here. Are you avoiding damage taken during cooldowns? If so, you could use Balefire. So with Balefire, it's an on-use intellect trinket. So again, you can use it with Belleros, although you don't ever want to pair this with Nime because you both want to use these during your cooldowns. It just doesn't work very well. Now, Balefire's just gives you a crap ton of intellect when you use it. We do, unfortunately, use this as a 2-minute trinket, even though it is a minute 30 seconds. That's just how our cooldowns work. But the very important downside to keep in mind with this trinket is that it decays faster when you're taking damage. So, importantly, this does not count self-damage that comes from the player. So, we're talking Shadow or Death self-damage, if you're using like Shadow Flame Tempered Armor Patch or the Vakash one-hander that also hits you, those self-damage events that come from the player don't count as taking damage when it comes to this trinket. But if like you're fighting a boss, the boss is doing raid-wide damage, every tick of that damage reduces 2 stacks of the trinket, and it starts with 100 is how that works. So if you're on a fight that has heavy damage taken during your cooldowns, you're likely going to get significantly less value out of Balefire Branch. So this one is by far the most volatile trinket on this list. It'll sim pretty decently, but you want to be extra careful when it makes sense to use it. You can also kind of game this a little bit. If you have any absorb shields active and you take damage and it doesn't break the shield, it doesn't actually tick damage on Balefire. So it's specifically when you lose health while taking damage from non-player generated sources, then you lose stacks. So this one's a bit convoluted as from a use case perspective. So you definitely keep that in mind. I think while gearing up, obviously this trinket is farmable, so maybe it's like, kind of like a stepping stone trinket, but maybe not something I would suggest for all of progression. Just really depends on the boss and kind of what's happening when you're in your cooldowns. Next up, this is the newer one to the list if you haven't seen the latest updates. So if you're on progression or does your raid die a lot, there's Ashes of the Ember Soul. So this trinket was recently buffed quite a bit. It's similar to Balefire. It's an on-use trinket that gives us primary stat that decays. Now the kind of downside here is after you lose the primary stat, you lose haste for a minute before it recovers. So you kind of have this like yin-yang, like cycled effect of the trinket. So what it effectively looks like is the trinket baseline gives you 738 haste. And after you use the trinket, when it expires after 20 seconds, you lose that same haste that's baseline on the trinket for a minute. So what that means is after you use the trinket and the effect is over, it's almost as if you don't have a trinket equipped for 60 seconds. So it is kind of leaning us more into that like bursty mode of our kit. Now what's interesting about this, and the reason why I ask, are you on progression or does your raid die a lot, is because it has a secondary effect. When circumstances are dire, your soul ignites, granting this bonus again without decaying. This bonus is massive. It's very impactful. Although there's no real gaming it here. They did change it to where in raids, this is specifically other group members effectively dying will trigger this, with some exceptions, but effectively you need people to die to proc it. So I put this on this list because I do think if you're in a guild like mine, people dying during prog fights is not uncommon. So which is why I put it on here. If you can get good use out of it and just literally proc it once during the fight, that's great. As it says, you can only proc it once per combat. If you can get that to happen, it's almost certainly going to be worth using. Again, kind of depends on what else you're using. Like similar to Nime, you can't use this and also have Balefire and also have Nime. You could pair it with Belros if you want. Otherwise, you can't pair it with another on-use effect just because we're also using it during our cooldowns. And then the fifth option is effectively everything else. So I put Nuse back in here because this is where it's still good even if you're not getting that immobilized bonus at this point. And otherwise, there are some actually pretty competitive passive trinkets this season. So if you're like kind of overwhelmed with all these on-use trinkets that I mentioned, Pip's Emerald Friendship Badge and C-Star are your kind of two great passive trinkets, like full passive trinkets. There's also kind of an honorable mention runner-up, which is the coagulated Genostar blood. So while gearing up, if you absolutely hate on-use trinkets, you're just looking for something passive, I would try to pair coagulated Genostar blood and C-Star, both of which are farmable inside of Mythic Plus. So that's the kind of highlights for our raid trinkets. So let's briefly talk about what changes when it comes to dungeon environments. So the dungeon pool for Season 3 is actually somewhat interesting. Overall, it does kind of feel like a bit more of a controlled season. We'll see how that kind of shakes out. I'll obviously update this as things change, but there is kind of less of kind of like ooga booga, pull a bunch of stuff and big AoE kind of stuff happening. Although there certainly are some dungeons where that does happen. That being said, what I've found is with testing, Shadow is already kind of struggling inside of dungeons, so getting trinkets that kind of bump up and boost our cooldowns isn't the best thing that we want. Kind of depends. What this is leaning us towards is Belros is still far and beyond your best in slot. You're still going to use this if you can. But then after that, you're seeing this kind of wall of passive trinkets to pair with Belros, which is effectively what we're seeing is that, we're kind of, you can use Pips, you can use C-Star, Coagulated shows up again, pairing those with Belros. There's also Augury of the Primal Flame. This is the last raid trinket that drops off the last boss that comes up. This one is kind of a more like end tier trinket for us. It's going to be pretty good, I think, for a lot of melee specs, or in general, if you're a spec that loves crit and versatility as your two main stats, you're going to get quite a good chunk of use out of this. Since we're not really that as a Shadow Priest, more towards, as we get to like end tier, we start getting more crit and verse. You might see this go up more. It is also slightly higher item level than other things, which just certainly help, just getting more base stats when you use it. But it can be a good option inside of keys, probably more on like the fortified side, because it's boss stand, which is kind of where the problem lacks here. Of course, you could still run Nuse if you have it, if you're just trying to nuke something on single target or get that priority target damage. And then the last trinket to bring up is Time Thief's Gambit for Mythic Plus. This one is kind of interesting. It's actually kind of fun to play with, especially if you're playing a Dark Ascension build. So notably, this is a 1-minute cooldown trinket. So what's good about that is if you're playing the kind of Dark Ascension Mindbender build, you get to use this with every single set of your cooldowns and to get that kind of big burst of haste. It is quite a lot of haste. It does end up DRing a little bit with most of our gear setups, which is why it's not like turbo best in slot or anything inside of Mythic Plus. The trick here is you have to kill mobs to delay the stun effect that comes. So if you don't delay it by enough, your character gets stunned for 5 seconds. And obviously if you're in the middle of a trash pack or a boss and you get stunned, that's pretty bad. So you have to kill things to kind of push that paradox back. This was kind of buggy even on PTR. It does say when you kill a major enemy, you restore the timeline completely. That effect was not always working. Hopefully that gets patched as we go into live with this. I did report it a lot on live servers. But yeah, this could be a fun trinket to play out with, especially at lower gear levels. Especially when you're killing mobs quickly. High key pushing, I think this is going to get kind of volatile, probably not worth using, because I'm not sure you're going to kill mobs fast enough, but it really just kind of depends on your group. So yeah, and I will kind of make an honorable mention in Mythic Plus for Ashes of the Ember Soul, because the kind of lockout effect is locked once per combat. You can certainly get better use cases out of this inside of Mythic Plus, although obviously, that kind of RNG of like your group members dying is also severely lessened just because there's less of you. So again, might be kind of a wild trinket to play with, not something I'd strictly suggest. From like a Mythic Plus key push scenario, but could be interesting or kind of fun to play out with. So those are my rough rankings for trinkets. So one thing to keep in mind is with these time walking trinkets, I actually don't think the Ulduar time walking is going to happen for quite some time. I think it's like January or something like that. It's a bit far away when Wrath of the Lich King time walking is actually going to happen next. But when it does, if you're just coming back to the season, you're watching this video kind of late, definitely pop in, try out Ulduar time walking. There's 4 trinkets that are competitive, especially at higher end gear levels and even at 476. All of those trinkets will compete with like not like quite best in slot, but like second or third best. So quite competitive. There's also one out of Firelands, a little bit less. And some of the other ones I didn't put on this list are also okay. These are just like the top big ones to think about. So when that rolls around, consider doing that if you're still struggling on trinkets. So yeah, that's all I had to say on trinkets. I put all of this in the written guide as well. And if there's any kind of tips or tricks with these trinkets or like caveats to bring about, I will kind of mention them here. I do kind of loosely tell you, how to use these trinkets, that kind of thing, and hopefully kind of give you a breakdown of this. And the other thing to highlight is we do have sim charts for these as well. So if you're looking at kind of like what this kind of relative performance is looking like, these are all published as well. You can kind of gauge like, hey, like how are these doing on single target? You can see like, here's Nime when you get that immobilized benefit, it just cranks. Now to note, I do show 2 different views here. This is just a single trinket view. And then on these all the different fight types, there's also combos as well, which can kind of change, what trinkets you want to pair together, specifically like the double on use trinkets. Because you can see here, like pairing Balefire with Nime is much worse, even though they look like they're 2 top trinkets. So this is another good resource to check out. Obviously, you should still do your own personal sims, but this is hopefully helping you give an idea of like what to target. And kind of what you're looking for depending on what kind of content you're interested in. And this will be updated throughout the patch. You can see there are a couple of trinkets on here that I didn't mention. If I didn't mention a trinket that dropped for you, it doesn't mean it's terrible. There are lots of competitive options kind of in that kind of, well, it's close enough range. So you can check that out. Even some of the profession trinkets, if you're really struggling to get something, there are options, they're out there. So you can use this as a good resource as well. So hopefully this was helpful while gearing up, talking about trinkets, and we'll catch you in the next video. Thanks for watching.